Officer, please, she didn't do anything. Calm down, mama. Ma'am, you need to step back right now.
They thought it was just a forgotten neighborhood, where the ambulance siren blared and then faded away, where a report was signed and everything went quiet as if nothing had happened. They thought the 72-year-old black woman before them was just an anonymous name in an unprotected alley. They thought the badge on their chests gave them the right to interrogate, the right to order, the right to convict, and the right to pull the trigger when they didn't feel like it. But those two police officers didn't know one detail that would turn a peaceful Sunday into a nightmare that would destroy their lives forever. Her name was Clara Holloway, 72 years old. Her gray hair was neatly trimmed short. Her hands bore the calluses of a lifetime of hard work. And most importantly, she was the kind of person everyone in the neighborhood knew. Everyone had received a hot meal from her, a word of comfort, a simple inquiry. For Clara, the world was still trustworthy. The strangers were just people who hadn't had dinner at her house yet. So when the patrol car slowly sped past, she didn't think much of it, because she had lived here long enough to believe that the law would at least respect an old woman. But it was that very gentle belief that brought her one step closer to death. It was a Sunday at the end of October. The air was cool, the sun still golden, as if retaining a hint of summer memories. In the old brick house at 412 Maple Street, the smell of sautéed onions mingled with the aroma of beef stew wafted from the slightly open kitchen window. Clara, wearing a faded floral apron, hummed an old hymn as she carefully wiped her hands on her dress. She glanced at the clock on the stove. 1:15. Marcus would be home in 10 minutes. Marcus Holloway, her only son, was the kind of person who was annoyingly punctual, but Clara found it comforting. He was a Marine, then joined the FBI. He rarely spoke in detail about his work, always just saying everything's fine and changing the subject. But Clara wasn't naive. She understood there were things her son saw out there that he couldn't bring home and put on the dinner table. She could only pray. For the 3 months Marcus was away on business in Chicago, Clara knelt by his bedside every night, begging God to bring him home safe and sound. Today, he finally arrived. And Clara did exactly what a mother does when she misses her child. She cooked his favorite dish: pot roast, collard greens, cornbread. She even bought a bottle of her special sauce, the kind Marcus jokingly called the Lucky Charm, for Sunday dinner. Clara wanted everything to be perfect, as if a delicious meal would make up for all the sleepless nights she'd spent worrying. She stepped out onto the porch, sweeping away a few fallen maple leaves from the steps. This porch was where she used to wait for her husband to come home from work, where she used to comfort Marcus when he was little, and where she used to chat with neighbors until dusk. Clara swept very slowly, very carefully, as if sweeping away anxieties she dared not name. She leaned the broom against the railing and walked down the short cement path to check the mailbox. An old sedan drove by, and she habitually waved, even though she didn't know the driver. She waved to the world, because she believed the world would wave back. And just as Clara bent down to look at the mailbox, a patrol car turned onto Maple Street. It was moving slower than usual, slow as if searching, slow as if choosing a target. Clara glanced over and thought it was probably one of the familiar police officers from the area, the ones who had greeted her, who had inquired about the garden in front of her house. But it wasn't one of those familiar faces. It stopped right in front of house number 412. The window rolled down. One man was young, with a short, military-style haircut and reflective sunglasses that completely covered his eyes. The other was older, chewing gum, his gaze weary and cold, as if he had grown weary of everything. "There's no hello, ma'am. There's no excuse me for bothering you." There was only one question, empty and sharp as a knife. "Do you live here?" Clara stood up straight, still clutching the few spam emails, trying to maintain a polite smile. She didn't know that, in their minds, she had already been condemned before she could even reply. And she didn't know that on the other side of the city, Marcus was driving home, a bouquet of lilies and a box of chocolates in the passenger seat, believing that in 10 minutes he would be able to hug his mother. He didn't know he would be exactly 3 seconds late. 3 seconds enough for a mother to become a victim, and enough for two police officers to realize they had just pulled the trigger in front of the most wrong person in the world. Clara wasn't the type to be easily intimidated. She'd lived on Maple Street for 40 years, witnessed the neighborhood change, seen families move in and out, experienced both peaceful days and nights of sirens blaring. She'd also encountered the police many times, enough to know who was decent and who simply viewed the neighborhood as a crime map to be controlled. But the two faces in the patrol car weren't like the people she knew. There was no Miller's friendly gaze, no Jenkins' playful question about the roses on the porch, only a coldness, as if they were dealing with something, not a person. Clara tried to maintain her politeness, as she had been taught her whole life. She looked up, her voice soft. "Yes, I live here. 40 years. What can I do for you?" She addressed them as you out of habit, as older people often do to younger people. But the word you didn't soften the atmosphere. It only made the younger man more uncomfortable, as if she were out of place. The young man didn't take off his sunglasses. He looked straight at her, his voice short and curt. "Papers. Are you the homeowner?" The question didn't sound like a question. It sounded more like an inspection. Clara was slightly taken aback, but then nodded. "I am the homeowner. The house is in my name and my former husband's. My husband is gone," she added, as if to remind him she had roots and a history here, not some newcomer. But that seemed to only irritate him further. He tilted his head, as if considering something, then suddenly uttered a sentence that made Clara freeze. "Are you living here alone?" Some questions sound perfectly normal, but when accompanied by the right eye contact and tone of voice, they become a hook to draw you into their story. Clara felt her heart beat a little faster. She didn't answer immediately. She just said, "My son is coming home soon. He's coming home for dinner tonight." The older man in the passenger seat spat out his chewing gum, smirking as if he'd heard it 100 times. He leaned toward the window, his voice drawn out. "We got a call reporting suspicious activity, drug trafficking. Right here." Then he looked around the small brick house, at the flower pot on the porch, at the wind chime, and smirked as if all the decency was just a facade. "Do you know anything about that?" For a second, Clara thought she'd misheard. She laughed, a genuine laugh. "Drugs? At my house, we only have pot roast and cornbread. You've got the wrong house." She pointed toward Elm Street. "The abandoned house and the hangout for the young people are over there, 2 blocks away." If things had gone normally, this would have been the moment they double-checked the address, apologized, and left. But the young man made no attempt to double-check. He pushed open the car door and stepped out. And as he straightened up, Clara realized he was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone accustomed to using their body to overpower others. His hand rested near his waist, right where his gun was, not quite drawn, but enough to say, "I can draw at any time." Clara swallowed hard. She was beginning to sense that something was wrong. The young man walked around the front of the car, stopping just a few steps away from her. "We're not at the wrong address," he said, his voice as hard as steel. "Step away from the house. Raise your hand so I can see." Clara frowned, still trying to remain calm. "Why should I? I'm standing in my yard. I'm cooking." At that moment, the older man also stepped down. He circled around to the other side, creating a pincer movement. The atmosphere on Maple Street suddenly changed, as if someone had silenced the birds. Across the street, Loretta Gable's curtains rustled slightly. Clara saw it. She knew her neighbors were watching. And she also knew that, in this moment, one wrong word, one wrong move, things could escalate faster than she imagined. Clara slowly raised both hands to her chest, as if to prove she hadn't done anything. She spoke, her voice still polite but slightly trembling. "Gentlemen, I'm 72 years old. I have arthritis. I haven't harmed anyone. If there's any misunderstanding, I can call the station. I know Captain Reynolds." The name Reynolds was uttered, and the young man paused for a fraction of a second. But then his eyes darkened as if challenged. The older man muttered, loud enough for Clara to hear, "Another way of using the boss to intimidate. Then he looked at her with a chillingly indifferent gaze. "They're always defiant." Clara felt a chill run down her spine at the word they. Who were they? Was it her? Or all the people who looked like her? Briggs Clara could now clearly see the name on the badge suddenly raised her voice. "Did you hear that? Get out of the house. Kneel down." Kneel down? Clara was stunned. I can't kneel. My knees hurt. And I didn't do anything wrong." Briggs took another step forward, the pressure weighing heavily on her chest. "You have no right to decide. You only have the right to follow." In the kitchen, behind Clara, the clock continued to tick. The pot roast was still simmering. And somewhere, Marcus was still driving home, believing he was about to hug his mother. Clara stood before the two strangers, a feeling growing stronger. They hadn't come to ask questions. They had come to make her a story they had prepared. And as Clara instinctively took a step back, her hand habitually reached for her apron pocket, where the old telephone lay. None of the three knew that it would be the last gesture of peace. The moment Clara took a step back, not out of defiance, but out of the instinctive self-preservation of an elderly person against the pressing pressure, the atmosphere on Maple Street instantly shifted. It was a subtle change, difficult to discern, but one anyone who had experienced it could sense. From inspection to suppression, from questioning to command, from a person to a target, Briggs saw that step back. And in his mind, it was no longer a natural reflex. It became suspicious behavior. "Stay still," Briggs snapped, his voice sharp, his hand gripping the gun's butt. He didn't draw it, but it was enough for Clara to understand that the line between words and violence was now a matter of breaths. "You're not cooperating." Clara was startled. "Not cooperating?" she repeated, her voice faltering. "I only stepped back because you were standing too close. I was scared." She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She was telling the truth, in the tone a mother uses when asking for understanding. But that truth had no place in this situation. Kowalski folded his arms, leaned back in his car, his gaze detached as if watching a familiar play. "Did you hear that?" he said, his voice slow and heavy. "Do what we tell you to do. Don't make things awkward." "Who's in this awkward situation?" Clara asked reflexively, immediately regretting her words. Briggs smirked, the smirk of someone confident in their power. "You," he replied curtly. Briggs took another step. The distance was now less than a meter. Clara could smell the sweat and the cold metallic scent emanating from his belt. She instinctively raised her hands higher, palms open as if to say, "I have nothing." "You," she said, her voice trembling noticeably. "I don't understand why you're doing this. I'm just an old woman. I've lived here my whole life. I'm still cooking for my son." "Who is your son?" Briggs asked immediately, as if she had just pressed a crucial button. "What's his name?" Clara hesitated for a moment. Not because she was afraid to speak, but because she wasn't used to having to prove something. "Marcus," she replied. "Marcus Holloway. He's coming home soon." Kowalski let out a dry laugh. "Another Marcus," he muttered. "There's always someone about to come back." Then he tilted his head, looking at Clara with a cold gaze. "Do you have a weapon on you?" The question felt like an invisible slap in the face. Clara's eyes widened. "No, of course not." She shook her head repeatedly. "I don't have a gun. I don't even know how to use one." "That's good," Briggs said, but his voice didn't soften at all. "Because if we find out you're lying, things will be very bad." Clara felt her throat dry up. She realized that every answer she gave, right or wrong, was being distorted to fit the mold they had created. She took a deep breath, trying to remember the pastor's words about remaining calm in the face of injustice. "Can I call someone?" she asked. "I have a phone. I can call the station. Or Captain Reynolds. He knows me." The moment she mentioned the phone, Briggs raised his hand to signal her to stop. "Don't," he said urgently. "Don't touch anything. I just wanted to call." "I said no," Briggs snapped, his voice rising sharply. Kowalski sighed, shaking his head as if witnessing something inevitable. "You've made things worse," he said, his tone half reproachful, half threatening. "Just do as you say, and it'll be over." Clara looked around, as if searching for something to hold on to. She saw the curtains across the street rustle. She knew Loretta was watching. The thought was both comforting and heartbreaking. At least someone saw. But then she realized something far more frightening. Being a witness didn't mean being protected. Briggs suddenly yanked the gun's holster, producing a dry, sharp click. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Clara's heart pound. "Kneel," Briggs repeated, slowly and clearly. "Now." "I can't," Clara whispered. "My pillow." "You have no right to negotiate," Briggs interrupted. "You only have the right to take orders." Clara felt tears welling up, not from pain, but from the cold humiliation. She had raised a child, buried a husband, worked her whole life to keep this home, and now, right in her own yard, she was being treated like a dangerous person simply for not bowing quickly enough. She took another half step back, her back almost touching the threshold. By familiar reflex, her hand reached for her apron pocket where her old flip phone lay. The only thing she could think of at this moment, to call someone in authority, to put an end to the misunderstanding that was swelling like a balloon about to burst. In Clara's mind, it was an act of crying for help. In Briggs' mind, it was a threat. And it was that deadly difference that dragged Maple Street to the brink of disaster, where one wrong shout, one wrong glance, and everything would be irreversible. Everything happened so fast that no one had time to think that this was the moment that would divide their lives into before and after. Clara's hand just barely touched the edge of the phone in her apron pocket. Not to hide it, not to threaten, just the reflex of an old person wanting to call someone who could say something that would bring everything to a halt. A simple sentence like, "You're all mistaken." But Briggs wasn't waiting for that. "Gun!" he yelled, his voice cracking with panic or something deeper, harder to name. The scream ripped through the quiet Maple Street like a knife, and in that instant, all other options vanished. Clara froze. Her eyes widened. "No," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "That's a phone." But Briggs drew his gun. The late autumn sunlight gleamed on the cold, black metal barrel. Time seemed to slow down a beat, enough for Clara to see the young man's face tense, his lips tightly pressed together, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. No one could tell what he was looking at: fear, anger, or simply emptiness. Bang! The first sound was dry and sharp, not like a gunshot in a movie, but more like a hard object being slammed forcefully into the air. Bang! The second beat followed immediately, as if the first wasn't enough to finish something. Clara felt a powerful force strike her chest, as if someone had hit her with a sledgehammer. She spun halfway, losing her balance. The blue sky above Maple Street swirled, the sunlight scattering into hazy patches. Strangely, she didn't feel any immediate pain, only cold and confusion. A very small, very ordinary thought popped into her head, frighteningly clear. The pot of meat. Who turned off the stove? Then her legs gave way. Clara Holloway fell backward onto the cement path in front of her house. Her floral apron quickly stained red, the red standing out cruelly against the gray background. Her folded phone flew out of her pocket, slid across the grass and stopped, opening up, the screen lighting up as if to prove something too late. Across the street, a heart-wrenching scream rang out. Loretta Gable clutched her chest, unable to believe her eyes. Birds scattered from the trees. Maple Street fell silent. Briggs stood rooted to the spot, his gun still pointed forward, his chest heaving violently. He gasped for breath, his mind blank. Then, as if clinging to a lifeline, he blurted out the words his training had instilled in him. She drew her gun. "You saw it, Kowalski." She drew her gun. Kowalski looked from the gun in Briggs's hand, down to the small, motionless body, then to the folding phone on the grass. His face turned pale. "Damn it, Briggs," he muttered, his voice hoarse. That's the phone." But Briggs didn't listen. Or didn't want to listen. He started pacing back and forth like a cornered animal, his voice high and urgent. "Call the station. Report a shooting. The suspect has been shot. I fear for my life." Kowalski hesitated for a moment in which, if he had knelt down, if he had called emergency services immediately, if he had chosen to be a man instead of a cop, perhaps the story would have been different. But he didn't. He pressed the radio, his voice trembling. Dispatch, officer involved shooting, 412 Maple Street. Clara lay there, her chest rising and falling weakly. Her eyes were open, gazing up at the sky as if searching for a familiar face. Blood spread across her back, soaking into the early falling maple leaves. No one came to her immediately. No one pressed on the wound. No one held her hand. Two men in uniform stood a few steps away from her, preoccupied with their own fears, with the story they needed to tell, rather than with the dying woman before them. And just then, while the gunfire still echoed through Maple Street, a deep, powerful roar of an accelerating engine came from the end of the street. A black Dodge Charger pulled in, speeding faster than usual, as if the driver had just spotted something wrong. Inside the car, Marcus Holloway was smiling. He rolled down the window, letting the autumn breeze in. On the passenger seat sat a bouquet of lilies and a box of his mother's favorite chocolates. He thought of dinner, of his mother's loving nagging. He thought he was almost home. He didn't know that in just 3 seconds, his world would collapse. And no one on Maple Street knew that the sound of the engine was the final blow to the lie that had just been told with 2 bullets. The Dodge Charger slammed on its brakes, the tires screeching, stopping just inches from the front of the patrol car. Marcus Holloway didn't have time to think. He didn't even have time to properly open the car door. He flung it open and leaped out as a purely instinctive reflex. An instinct that only arises when the heart recognizes danger before reason. Briggs and Kowalski spun around, both startled by the sudden appearance. Briggs instinctively reached for his gun again. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice still trembling with adrenaline. "The scene is under control. Get back in the car immediately." But Marcus heard nothing but the sound of his own blood pounding in his ears. He saw the floral apron. He noticed the gray hair. He saw the small body lying motionless on the cement path in front of his house. The cry burst from his chest, rough, ragged, as if torn from his throat. Marcus ran, collapsing to his knees beside Clara Holloway. His knees slammed against the cold concrete, but he felt no pain. He felt only emptiness. "Mom, look at me. It's Marcus." He placed his hand on her chest, and immediately his hand was soaked. The blood was still warm, still alive, seeping through his fingers as if to say that life hadn't completely given up yet. Marcus pressed harder, trying to do what hundreds of battlefield medical training sessions had taught him, even though his mind was completely muddled. "Call an ambulance," Marcus yelled, turning to look at the 2 police officers. "Call an ambulance right now." Briggs remained standing there, gun at the ready, his eyes darting wildly. You have to back away," he stammered. "She's a suspect." The suspect? That was like a punch to Marcus's face. He looked down at his mother, the woman who had raised him, who had swept every leaf from this porch, who had cooked him every Sunday meal, then looked up at Briggs, his gaze changing. The panic in him subsided. What remained was a chilling silence. "My mother was shot," Marcus said slowly, each word falling heavily. "And if she had died because you were even a second slower, then everything you think of as procedure wouldn't have saved you." Kowalski finally pressed the radio, his voice hoarse. "Dispatch, urgently need EMS, 412 Maple Street." Marcus turned back to Clara. Her eyes were open, but her gaze was beginning to fade, as if the sky above was pulling her away from this world. Her lips moved, very softly. "Marcus, it's me, Mom." He leaned down, his forehead almost touching hers. "Don't fall asleep, Mom. You've waited for me for 3 months. Just wait 5 more minutes, okay?" A very weak smile appeared on Clara's lips. Her thin, trembling hand lifted to touch her son's cheek. The touch was so gentle that Marcus feared a single stronger breath would make it vanish. "My sweet son." The hand fell. Clara Holloway's eyes opened one last time, then went blank. Her chest stopped rising and falling. Her body felt lighter, as if the burden of a lifetime had finally been lifted. Marcus called out very softly. There is no answer. A blood-curdling scream erupted from his chest. It was no longer the voice of a grown man, not the voice of an FBI agent, but the voice of a child whose only world had been taken away. Briggs stood motionless. Kowalski turned away. Marcus bent down, resting his forehead on his mother's chest, remaining there for a few seconds. When he lifted his head, the tears were gone. His face was blank, stiff as stone. His hands were blood red, his white shirt stained. He stood up slowly. Briggs instinctively took a step back. Marcus pulled out his wallet, his movements eerily calm. He opened it. The FBI badge gleamed in the afternoon sun, cold and sharp as a blade. "Federal Agent Marcus Holloway," he said, his voice low, even, and emotionless. "Put down your gun. Now." In that moment, everything changed. The two police officers realized something they should have known from the beginning. The woman they had just shot was not an anonymous old lady. She was the mother of the most wronged people. And their nightmare had only just begun. The blaring sirens of patrol cars from multiple directions shattered the heavy silence that enveloped Maple Street. Flashlights reflected off windows, old brick roofs, and even the still warm pools of blood on the cement pavement. Other patrol cars swarmed in, lining both ends of the street like a wall. Neighbors peeked out, then recoiled, sensing that something was amiss, not an ordinary incident. Marcus still stood there, on his porch, his blood-stained hands hanging loosely at his sides. The FBI badge still gleamed in his hand. Briggs was no longer screaming. He stood stiff, as if all his energy had been drained. Kowalski avoided Marcus's gaze, bowing his head and repeatedly licking his dry lips. A black SUV pulled up. The door opened. Captain Bill Reynolds stepped out. He was the kind of man who instantly changed the atmosphere the moment he arrived. A thick neck, a bushy mustache, the confident gait of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. Reynolds' eyes darted quickly across the scene. Two of his officers standing awkwardly, a blood-soaked stranger, a body lying in the walkway. In just a few seconds, he understood the most important thing who needed protecting. Reynolds walked straight past Marcus, without greeting or asking any questions, as if he didn't exist. "Get him out of the scene," Reynolds yelled at the two newly arrived officers. "Lock the weapon. Put him in the car." One man hesitated, glancing at the badge on Marcus's hand. "Captain, he's a federal." "I don't care who he is," Reynolds snapped. "He's interfering with our shootout." Marcus turned back, his gaze fixed on Reynolds. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm guarding my mother's body until the forensic team arrives." Reynolds smirked. "Your mother?" He glanced down at Clara, then turned away as if looking at an inanimate object. "That body is now the evidence. You need to back off." The evidence felt like a knife twisting in Marcus's chest, but he didn't explode. He understood perfectly what was happening. This wasn't a panicked reaction from two individuals anymore. This was a machine beginning to operate. Two officers grabbed Marcus's arms. For a brief moment, his body tensed in a fighting reflex, causing them both to freeze. But Marcus let go immediately. He let them lead him away, saying only one sentence to Reynolds as he was being escorted. "If a single detail at this scene is altered, I will make you pay." Reynolds smirked, but didn't reply. Marcus was shoved into the back seat of a patrol car. The door slammed shut. Through the thick glass, he watched the familiar dance of cover-up begin. A union lawyer appeared suspiciously quickly, pulled Briggs aside, and whispered something in her ear. Briggs began to reenact the scene with her hands, describing she pulled out a gun. Kowalski stood further away, his face pale, his hands trembling as if he didn't know where to put them. Then Marcus saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Sergeant Sterling, a brother who had previously reviewed files related to abuse of power complaints, approached Clara's body. He bent down as if placing a marker next to the fallen telephone, but when he stood up, Marcus saw clearly. In the grass, near his mother's motionless hand, another metal object had appeared. A small revolver. A drop gun. "No!" Marcus slammed against the window. "I see it. He's setting up the gun. He's setting up the gun." The police officer in the front seat turned his head, his face blank. "Calm down, sir. I didn't see anything. Outside, Reynolds turned his back to Marcus, his voice louder than usual, deliberately made clear by the body cameras. Recover the weapon. The victim appears to be carrying a .38 caliber pistol. Officers fear for their lives. The camera flashes. One click of the camera, one lie stamped into the official record. Marcus sat in silence. He understood that shouting was useless. They were rewriting the story right before his eyes, line by line, coldly and expertly. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm. His eyes moved, memorizing each face, each insignia, each small movement. The position of the gun, the distance to his mother's hand, the angle of light, the direction of the shadow. They thought that by making Clara Holloway an armed suspect, they had everything under control. But what they didn't know was, Marcus Holloway was more than just a son who had lost his mother. He is a profiler, and from that moment, an investigation began in his mind. 48 hours later, the official story was framed, neat and cold like a weather report. On the television screen hanging in the living room of 412 Maple Street, the anchor with his perfectly combed hair read word for word from the police department's press release. Tragedy on Maple Street. Officers responded to a drug trafficking call. The suspect, a 72-year-old woman, drew a weapon. Officers, fearing for their lives, were forced to open fire. The scrolling text below was even more chilling. A .38 revolver was recovered at the scene. Marcus stood before the screen, his hands clenched so tightly they turned white. Each word was like a new bullet, striking the image of the gentle mother he knew. They weren't just shooting his mother down the aisle. They were shooting her again, with words, with labels labeling her suspect, with a gun discovered too late and too conveniently. He turned off the TV. In the silent house, the smell of bleach still lingered. Marcus knelt down, wiping the bloodstains from the cement floor with a rag and cold water, as if doing it thoroughly enough would erase the memory. But the dark stain remained etched in his mind, clearer than any image on a screen. Marcus wasn't alone. Sarah Jenkins, an FBI cybersecurity expert, sat at the dining table, laptop open, her gaze intensely focused, almost emotionless. D-Day, Washington. Marcus's old colleague from their time working together leaned back in his chair, silent, his large arms crossed over his chest. The kitchen where Clara used to cook had become a war room. The body cam footage has been released, Sarah said, her voice even. But there's a problem. The video freezes and loses sound exactly 6 seconds before the shooting. She looked up at Marcus. They say it's a technical glitch due to sudden movement. Marcus chuckled dryly. Technical glitches always happen when they need them most. Not only that, D-Day added. They also said there were witnesses, but nobody was willing to speak up. Mrs. Gable across the street has a Ring camera. I went there. She wouldn't open the door. She said the police had been there, that the camera was broken and it's best not to get involved. Marcus turned his head to look out the window, where Loretta Gable's house stood quietly. His grandparents used to give him hard candy when he was a child. She wasn't cowardly. She was just afraid. And this system thrives on that fear. They're locking down the story, Marcus said, his voice low, turning my mother into a statistic. If we leave it alone, in a few weeks everything will be forgotten. Sarah nodded, typing quickly. I'm pulling in internal files. Briggs has 4 excessive violence complaints, all involving people of color. All dismissed. Kowalski is different. 20 years of service. No major scandals, but a mountain of debt. Heavy financial pressure. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, the pieces began to fit together. Briggs was the hot-headed man with backing. Kowalski was the weakling, afraid of losing what little he had left. Reynolds was the gatekeeper, and Sterling was the dirty hand doing the job no one else wanted to see. They will protect Briggs, Marcus said. They will sacrifice Kowalski if necessary. And they believe that I am just a grieving son, no longer sane enough to do anything. He opened another file, his own notes. But they forgot what I do for a living. Marcus stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where his mother's old telephone used to sit. To break a lie protected by an entire system, you can't just smash it in. You have to make it collapse on its own. He looked at Sarah. "I need Kowalski's personal number, not his work number." Sarah nodded, without asking any further questions. "I do, and I need to know what he fears most." "Money," Sarah replied immediately. "And being blamed?" Marcus held the burner phone, turning it slightly in his hand. "Good. Then we don't need to convince him. We just need to put the right fear in front of him." He paused, his voice slow and steady. "Not for revenge. To bring the truth to light." Outside, Maple Street remained as quiet as if no gunshots had ever been heard. But in the small kitchen where a mother once cooked Sunday dinners, a silent counterattack had begun. And this time, Marcus Holloway wouldn't let the story be rewritten. Night fell slowly on Maple Street, as if the entire neighborhood were holding its breath. The yellow light emanating from the windows of 412 no longer held its familiar warmth. It resembled the lights of a command center more than a rooftop. Marcus sat in his car, parked a few doors down from Kowalski's. Engine off, only the sound of metal cooling. In the passenger seat, D-Day silently checked the recording device. In Marcus's ear, Sarah's voice was soft and clear, transmitted through the earpiece. "I've blocked Kowalski's personal number. His entire transaction history. He owes $40,000, 3 months overdue on his mortgage. And his ex-wife just threatened to sue him for alimony." Marcus looked through the windshield, where Kowalski's house was shrouded in darkness. "He's scared," Marcus said calmly. "And scared people don't sleep. They wait for the doorbell." He dialed the number from the burner phone. It rang for a long time. No one answered. The phone went dead. Marcus didn't hang up. He called again. A second time. A third time. On the fourth try, the call was answered. "Hello?" Kowalski's voice was hoarse, as if he had been drinking and staying up all night. "Stan," Marcus said, without introduction or beating around the bush. "They're preparing to hang you." Silence on the other end of the line. Marcus knew he'd hit the right spot. "Briggs is talking to the DA," Marcus continued, his voice even as he read a report. "He says you were the one who yelled, 'She has a gun.' He says you scared him." "No, that's not right," Kowalski blurted out, his breath coming in short gasps. "I didn't." "Did you record in your report that Sterling dropped the .38 on the grass?" Marcus interrupted, very quietly. "Did you record that they rubbed the gun against her hand?" This silence was suffocatingly heavy. Marcus heard gasping breaths, the clinking of glasses on the table, the sound of the man breaking something. "You know it's felony, Stan," Marcus continued, not raising his voice at all. "Accessory. Tampering. Briggs has his councilman. Reynolds has his whole apparatus. And you, what do you have? A house about to be foreclosed on. An unpayable debt. And a name for them to put in their report." "Stop," Kowalski whispered. "Who are you?" Marcus didn't answer the question. He offered a way out, the only thing a frightened person could see. "Meet me at the diner on 4th Street. In an hour. Go alone. Or you'll go to jail for a murder you didn't pull the trigger for." Marcus hung up the phone. Inside the car, D-Day looked at him and nodded. "He'll leave." Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the dark house. If Reynolds doesn't manage to stop him in time. And as if it were preordained, the headlights of a patrol car flashed on at the end of the street. The car stopped right in front of the Kowalski's house. The door opened. Captain Reynolds stepped out, his gait leisurely, like someone who had come to settle an internal matter. "Damn it," D-Day muttered. Marcus gripped the steering wheel. He's got a feel for it. Reynolds knocked on the door. Kowalski opened it. Marcus could clearly see the panic on the man's face as Reynolds placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Where are you going, Stan?" "You look so tense," Reynolds said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "Get in the car. We need to review the testimony." For consistency, Kowalski was led out, practically pushed into the back seat of the patrol car. The doors slammed shut. The car rolled away, without sirens blaring, toward the old industrial area near the riverbank, a place with sparse cameras where stories vanished. Marcus started the car. "Follow them," he said. "Keep your distance." Sarah leaned into the headset, her voice strained. "I'm connecting the Reynolds GPS. I've also managed to activate the internal microphone, but the signal is weak. I'll record as much as I can. It needs to be clear, Marcus replied. Just one honest confession will suffice. The car sped past sparsely populated rows of houses, the streetlights fading like memories. Marcus switched off the headlights as they entered the abandoned dockyard. From a distance, he saw Reynolds pulling Kowalski out of the car. A few minutes later, a gleaming sports car arrived. Briggs stepped out, looking irritated as if he'd been called from a safe place. Marcus and D-Day exited the vehicle, closing in behind the rusty containers. Marcus raised the microphone to direct the attack. His heart pounded steadily, coldly. He was no longer the orphaned son. He was a profiler standing before his prey. Briggs' voice rang out in the night. "Run, Stan? Just sign it and get it over with." Kowalski burst into tears. "I couldn't do it. I saw them drop their guns." Reynolds roared. "Shut up. There's nothing there. We're in control of the evidence." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. It was an acknowledgement. He signaled to D-Day. Sarah whispered into her headset. "I'm recording." On that dark dock, amidst rusting steel and the river wind, the truth began to fall not for justice, but for fear. And Marcus knew that one more step, and the entire house of lies would collapse. The river wind swept across the abandoned dockyard, carrying the smell of rust and old oil, whipping against the warped steel plates that groaned like a belated warning. Under the pale yellow light of the patrol car, Kowalski stood trembling between Reynolds and Briggs, looking like someone who had gone too far to turn back. Briggs lit a cigarette, took a long drag, then chuckled, his laughter hollow like a tin can. "Sign it, Stan. Deal. City pays. Everyone goes home." Kowalski shook his head, tears welling up. "It's not like that. I saw it. I saw Sterling take the gun from her ankle. I saw him rub it against her hand." The words broke. There was no turning back. Briggs cursed, threw his cigarette to the ground, and stomped it out. Reynolds stepped forward, his voice low but menacing. "What are you talking about? Do you want to self-destruct? Do you know how high the suicide rate is among officers under investigation?" The words fell like a hanging sentence. Behind the containers, Marcus gripped the microphone tightly. His heart beat slowly, steadily, a sign of absolute concentration. Sarah whispered into the headset. "The audio's clear. I have that line." D-Day glanced at Marcus, her eyes asking, "Now?" Marcus shook his head slightly. "Not yet." Briggs turned to Reynolds, his voice sharp. "Cap, let me talk to him." Then Briggs moved closer to Kowalski, pointing to his chest. "Listen, my uncle's got it all covered. My uncle's on the council. You just sign, and you get your pension. Don't sign, you go to jail." The brazen confession of political backing hung in the air like the smell of gasoline in the darkness. Kowalski slumped to the ground, his hands covering his head. "I can't take it anymore. I don't want to die in prison for something I didn't do." Reynolds breathed heavily, his hand sliding down to the holster. "Enough. This ends here." This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for, the moment when power would bare its fangs. He raised his hand to signal. The sky above the dock suddenly blazed. Tactical searchlights switched on from above, silent drones hovered, casting a harsh white light down on the three men. A deep, decisive voice boomed from the loudspeaker. "Federation, lay down your weapons immediately." Reynolds spun around, his hand frozen in midair. Briggs cursed, taking a step back. Kowalski collapsed to the ground as if relieved. Marcus emerged from the shadows, FBI badge hanging from his chest, gun drawn but pointed low, a posture of someone in control, not looking for an excuse to fire. D-Day stood slightly behind him, shielding his side. "Bill Reynolds," Marcus said, his voice as flat as frozen water, "you've just admitted to conspiracy to cover up, threatening witnesses and violating civil rights. It's all been recorded." Reynolds roared. "You have no authority here," Sarah retorted, her voice sharp. "Title 18, USC 242. When you strip citizens of their citizenship under the guise of law, this is our authority." Sirens blared from all directions, not local, but FBI and state troopers. Briggs looked around, his face pale. A moment later, he collapsed to his knees, weeping. "I was following orders. Reynolds told me to shoot." The so-called brotherhood shattered faster than glass. Marcus stepped forward, without looking at Briggs. He stopped in front of Reynolds and pulled out the handcuffs. "You turned my mother into evidence," Marcus said softly, just loud enough for Reynolds to hear. "Now I'll turn you into the accused." Click. The handcuffs snapped shut, cold and decisive. Reynolds was dragged away, still cursing, still calling out the names of those who would no longer answer the phone. Kowalski was helped to his feet, gasping for breath, his eyes a mixture of panic and relief. Sarah said through the earpiece, "I have it all. The sound, the time, the location. There's no escape." Marcus stood in the middle of the dock, the wind billowing his shirt. He looked up at the darkening sky where the drone lights were fading. The arrest brought no sense of victory, only a chilling certainty. The next battle would take place where lies are most powerful. The courtroom. And there, he wouldn't allow them to rewrite his mother's story ever again. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse opened like a fortress. Gray stone, cold glass, metal fences, and cameras crisscrossed the steps. Outside, 2 crowds faced each other across the fence. One side held signs that read "Back the Blue." The other held photos of Clara Holloway with the simple, heartbreaking inscription, "She held a phone." Shouts mingled with car horns and helicopters, like a city battling its own conscience. Inside courtroom, 4B, the air was cold and heavy. The smell of wax mingled with the scent of old paper. Marcus Holloway sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's desk. He wore a dark gray suit, his back straight, his face expressionless. Here, he wasn't an agent. He wasn't a hunter. He was a son forced to listen to his mother being dissected verbally. At the defendant's table, Thomas Briggs, wearing thick-rimmed glasses, bowed his head like a lost student. Bill Reynolds, with his mustache shaved, tried to project a belatedly gentle image. Behind them was the defense team led by Preston Vane, a man whose words were as soft as velvet and as sharp as a knife. Vane stepped out in the opening remarks, his voice low and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a neighborhood with a history of crime. This was a dangerous call." The 2 officers didn't wake up to kill anyone, they woke up to go home. He paused just in time, letting fear do its part. When they saw what looked like a weapon, they followed their training. Survival instinct. The word instinct hovers like a suit of armor. Vane twists the story, layer by layer, transforming Clara into a frail, confused old woman, turning the flip phone into a gun-like object, and making Maple Street a pretext. He doesn't need to prove she has a gun. He just needs to sow reasonable doubt. When it was his turn to interrogate, Vane turned to Marcus. "You're a profiler. You're used to seeing things as a conspiracy. You arrived at the scene agitated. Could it be that you misinterpreted what you saw?" Marcus kept his voice steady. "I saw my mother bleeding. I saw a gun being placed down afterward." Vane chuckled faintly. "You're speculating." Gavel. Sustained. Marcus's words were dismissed, as if the truth needed a license to exist. For a brief moment, Reynolds turned to look at Marcus, not smiling, just a slight lift of his chin. A subtle signal of defiance. Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his hands under the table. He knew. If emotions took over, they would win. Then Elena Vance, the federal prosecutor, stood up. Not in a loud voice. Not with flowery language. "The prosecution requests the summons of witness Loretta Gable." The courtroom buzzed. Vane jumped up in protest. "Unexpected. We haven't—" Vance interrupted, her voice sharp as steel. "The witness is under federal protection due to a threat to her life." The judge nodded. Permission granted. The door opened. An elderly woman was wheeled in. Small. Trembling. But as she passed the defendant's table, her gaze locked on Reynolds, unblinking. Fearless. Marcus sat up straighter. He understood. From this moment on, the story would no longer belong to those who knew how to speak eloquently. It would belong to those who dared to tell the truth. Loretta Gable placed her hand on the Bible, her thin hand trembling slightly, but her eyes remained clear. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke an old, hoarse voice, yet clear and distinct. I lived across from Clara for 40 years. I saw her every day. She swept the porch, watered the flowers, waved to strangers. Elena Vance asked softly, "What did you see that day?" Loretta took a deep breath. "I saw the police car. I saw the young man shouting. I saw Clara frightened." She raised her hand to pick up the phone. Vane sprang to his feet, his voice as sweet as sugar coated in a knife. "Mrs. Gable, is there something wrong with your eyes? Cataract? Are you sure?" Loretta didn't flinch. "I'm old, but I'm not blind, and I can tell the difference between a telephone and a gun." A wave of commotion rose. The judge struck the gavel. Silence. Elena took another step forward. "After the shooting, what happened?" Loretta swallowed, her eyes wet, but her voice steady. "I saw someone come up later, that man over there." She pointed directly at Reynolds. "He was talking to someone else. Then the other person took a gun from their ankle. I saw them rub the gun against Clara's hand." The courtroom froze. Vane protested vehemently. "Speculation. There's no evidence." Reynolds sprang to his feet, his voice harsh. "You, old woman, are lying." Bang! The judge struck the gavel. "Sit down. One more time and I'll punish you." Elena wasn't in a hurry. She turned to the jury and said calmly, yet coldly, "We have evidence." Vane smirked. "The cameras are broken. There's no video." Elena smiled, the smile of someone who knows they're opening a door. "Mrs. Gable had a Ring camera. The police said it was broken, but the system automatically uploads to the cloud. Mrs. Gable sent access codes to relatives as a precaution." The large screen lit up. Video appeared clear, uncut, unshaken. Clara stood on the porch, a floral apron, sunlight falling on her silver hair. Briggs' voice rang out high, sharp. Clara said, "I'll call." A flash of silver the phone. Then a shout of, "Gun! Bang! Bang!" Clara fell. In the courtroom, someone wept. Marcus bowed his head, his hands clenched. The video fast forwards. An SUV arrives. Reynolds gets out. He leans over and says something. Sterling appears, reaches down to his ankle, and pulls out a gun. He bends down, rubs the gun against Clara's hand, and places it on the grass. No blind spots. No ambiguity. Each frame seems frozen in time. When the screen went off, the room fell silent. Vane stood motionless, his hand touching his forehead. Briggs sobbed, hunched over. Reynolds was stunned, his eyes wide, as if he had just realized something beyond his control, the truth. Elena spoke slowly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is not a mistake. This is a murder disguised in uniform and a conspiracy to bury it." The judge looked at the jury. "You have seen the evidence." Marcus lifted his head. There was no relief, only a pain that could be called by its true name. He knew. From this moment on, they could no longer rewrite his mother's story. The jury left the courtroom in a heavy silence. The doors closed, leaving behind tense faces, clasped hands, and a room where no one dared breathe loudly. Marcus sat motionless. He didn't pray. He had prayed enough his whole life. Now, he was waiting not for himself, but for the truth to be called out in its entirety. 4 hours felt like 4 years. When the jury turned around, none of them looked toward the defendant's table. It was a sign, a chilling sign that anyone who had ever sat in a courtroom understood. Judge Harrison ordered the defendants to stand. Thomas Briggs had to be pulled up by his lawyer. His knees trembled. Bill Reynolds stood straighter, but his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. In the case of the United States v. Thomas Briggs, the presiding judge read, his voice even and emotionless, "For second-degree murder, we declare guilty." A sigh escaped somewhere in the courtroom. Briggs slumped into his chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." But those words fell to the floor, meaningless in the face of the image etched in the eyes of the 12 men who had just delivered their verdict. The presiding judge continued, "In the case of the United States versus Bill Reynolds, on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and deprivation of civil rights under the guise of law. We declare, guilty." Reynolds closed his eyes. His stiff neck slumped in a brief moment, a single moment of collapse. No more defiant gaze, no more thin smile, only a man who had just lost his last shield. Judge Harrison didn't prolong his sentence. He looked directly at Briggs, his voice low and heavy as stone. "You were given a gun to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you became a threat. You shot an unarmed woman and then let your superiors cover it up. The court sentences you to 45 years in federal prison." Briggs howled a sound unlike any human voice before being held captive by marshals. Then the judge turned to Reynolds. The room fell silent. "Bill Reynolds," he said slowly, "you are not just a coward. You are the cancer of a system built to serve the people. You used your power to build a kingdom of fear, turning uniforms into licenses for crime." Reynolds tried to open his mouth, but no sound came out. "The court sentences him to life imprisonment under federal law, without parole," the judge continued. Then he paused long enough for each word to sink in. "The court recommends confinement in a general detention facility, without special protection." Those words fell like an iron door slamming shut. Reynolds trembled. He understood what it meant. Bang! The hammer struck. Marshals approached. Reynolds was handcuffed. He turned his head, searching for familiar faces, promised connections, but no one responded. Power has a very short memory. Reynolds' gaze rested on Marcus. Marcus stood up. He didn't cheer. He said nothing. He simply placed his hand on his chest where his badge usually rested and pointed down at the floor in front of Reynolds. That was it. Reynolds was dragged away, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. The courtroom remained silent, not the silence of victory, but the silence of a truth that had finally stood firm. Marcus sat down. His shoulders slumped slightly, just a little, but enough to show that a burden had been lifted. There was no complete justice for a lost Sunday dinner, but today, at least, the truth wasn't buried again. And that was the only thing he allowed himself to retain as he left the courtroom, the truth, undistorted, unmasked, unswallowed by silence. The large doors of the courthouse swung open, and the afternoon sun streamed down the steps like a scorching wave. Cameras instantly focused on Marcus. Microphones jutted out from every direction. Questions poured in, overlapping and urgent, as if the justice just served was merely the prelude to another performance. "Agent Holloway, are you satisfied with the verdict? Is this justice for Clara? Do you have a message for police nationwide?" Marcus stopped at the lowest step. Sarah and D-Day stood behind him, silent, like two pillars. He looked directly into the nearest camera lens. There was no triumph in his eyes, only weariness and a painful sobriety. "Justice isn't a verdict," Marcus said slowly, his voice hoarse but firm. "Justice is my mother being alive to cook Sunday dinner. Today we have no justice. We have accountability." The crowd fell silent. Marcus continued. "If there hadn't been cameras, if there hadn't been witnesses willing to come forward, if there hadn't been federal pressure, the story would have been different. And that's the problem. This system shouldn't be based on luck." He turned to the group holding pictures of his mother. "There are many Claras out there, and there are many Reynolds. The badge doesn't make anyone a god. It makes you a servant. If you forget that, you'll suffer the consequences." Marcus stepped out, leaving the barrage of questions behind him. The noise faded. He got into the car, closed the door, and in that rare moment of quiet, he leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The public battle was over. But he knew this wasn't the end of it all. In the days that followed, the city moved as if it had just woken from an unpleasant dream. The police department announced a reorganization. An independent committee was formed. Several officers requested early retirement. Press releases rained down enough to reassure, but not enough to heal. Marcus returned to Maple Street. House number 412 was quiet. No more lockdown tape. No more traffic lights. Only the cement stains, scrubbed clean, too clean, as if someone had tried to erase the indelible. He stood on the porch, looking at the steps where his mother used to sit, waiting for him. The wind gently swayed the old wind chime, producing a familiar, heart-wrenching sound. He walked into the kitchen. The wall clock was still ticking. On the shelf, the old pot was still there. Marcus placed his hand on the lid, closing his eyes for a moment. There was no smell of pot roast, no humming, only emptiness, an emptiness that the sentence could not fill. That evening, he sat alone on the porch. A gray stray cat, the one his mother usually fed, creeped up. Marcus opened a box of food and set it down on the steps. "Eat," he said softly. "Now it's my turn to worry." The cat lowered its head to eat. Marcus looked up at the sky. The first star appeared. Small but persistent, he took a deep breath, letting his anger settle into something else heavy, but something he could carry. He whispered, not addressing anyone in particular, "I kept my promise, Mom." Maple Street was silent. Not the silence of cover-ups anymore, but the silence of memory. And in that silence, Marcus understood that this story didn't end in the courtroom. It continued in every decision. Every time people chose to tell the truth instead of convenience, so that other Sunday dinners wouldn't be stolen again. In the weeks following the trial, the city struggled to return to its old rhythm. News shifted to other topics. The crowds outside the courthouse dispersed. The hashtags died down. But for those who lived on Maple Street, and for Marcus, there was no return to normal. Only a new normal, where everything carried an invisible crack. The police department announced a series of changes: retraining, procedural reviews, and the temporary suspension of several familiar names. The press releases were well written, enough to reassure the public. But Marcus knew that real reform didn't come from paperwork. It came from memory, the memory of the price paid when power goes unchecked. He was offered a return to work, even a promotion. Marcus refused. Not out of resentment, but because he understood that some battles couldn't be fought in the same role. He accepted an offer to join a small, quiet, interdisciplinary task force that investigated legitimate shootings with unusual characteristics. No press conferences, no glamour, just files, data, and tough questions. On Maple Street, Loretta Gable rehangs her curtains, but no longer keeps them closed. She steps out onto the porch each afternoon, sits upright, like a living landmark of memory. When asked why she dares to stand out, she simply says, "Because if I remain silent, I will never be able to sleep again." The answer spreads slowly but persistently. Marcus returned to his mother's house a few more times. He rearranged the furniture, unhurriedly. Each item told a story. The floral apron was washed and folded. The old Bible was put back in its place. He didn't turn the house into a shrine of grief. He kept it as a home, just as his mother had done. One afternoon, he invited some neighbors over for dinner. No perfect pot roast, just a simple meal. They talked about the little things, the tree in front of the house, the stray cat, the weather. But when the meal was over, someone put a hand on Marcus's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for not letting us be forgotten." Marcus nodded. He understood the most terrifying thing wasn't violence, but being considered forgivable. Somewhere in the system, people like Reynolds become cautionary tales, not because they're worse than others, but because they've been allowed to be bad for too long. And each time a case is reopened, each time a camera is checked all the way to the cloud, a small door opens, not for revenge, but for accountability. As night fell on Maple Street, the wind chimes tinkled softly. Marcus stood on the porch, gazing at the quiet street. He didn't wish for the world to be perfect. He only wished it were less cruel and brave enough to correct mistakes when necessary. Because there are Sunday dinners that have been lost. But if memory is preserved, if truth is still called by name, then other dinners on other streets can still be saved. The last night Marcus stayed at 412 Maple Street. It was very quiet. No strong wind. No car horns. No flashing lights reflecting off the walls like in the early days. Just the soft darkness and the murmur of insects, sounds that Clara Holloway had once called a sign that the world was still okay. Marcus sat on the porch, the old wooden chair creaking under his weight. In his hand was his mother's flip phone. It had been returned from the evidence storage, slightly dented at the corner, scratched, but still working. He flipped the cover. The screen lit up, displaying the old wallpaper. Marcus, in his Marine uniform, standing next to Clara. She was smiling broadly. The smile of someone who believed her son had become a decent person. "I did it, Mother," Marcus whispered, his voice fading into the night. "I didn't let them twist the truth." He knew that if Clara were still alive, she wouldn't talk about the court, about the severity of the sentence. She would ask him if he was eating properly, getting enough sleep, and remembering to pray. Clara never thought of justice as something grand. For her, justice was living peacefully in her own backyard. Marcus folded his phone shut and placed it on the small table beside his chair. The familiar stray cat reappeared, rubbing its head against his leg. Marcus bent down and gently stroked its back. "From now on, it's just the two of us," he said, half jokingly. The cat meowed softly, then curled up. Elsewhere, behind the thick walls of a federal prison, those who once believed badges were armor are facing a stark truth. Power protects no one when the truth speaks. No cameras, no press releases. No one calls them by their titles anymore. Marcus stood up, taking one last look at the street where he grew up. Maple Street wasn't iconic. It was just an ordinary street, and that's precisely why the story here mattered. Because if this could happen to Clara Holloway, it could happen anywhere, to anyone considered not important enough. He locked the door. The sound of the lock clicking was dry but decisive. Marcus put the key in his pocket, not as a farewell, but as a promise to return to remind himself why he continued with this difficult work. As Marcus walked away, the eastern sky began to fade. A new day was dawning. The loss couldn't be erased, but it was enough to keep going. And that's the message this story leaves. It's not a feeling of satisfaction at the punishment of the wicked. Rather, it's a reminder that truth needs to be defended, especially when it's inconvenient. That each time we remain silent in the face of injustice, another Clara may be lost. And that justice, however late, is still worth pursuing if we don't turn away. If this story makes you pause and think, please share it. Not to sow anger, but to preserve the memory, because memory is the only thing that makes power wary. Thank you for staying until the very end. Stay safe. And never believe that an ordinary life can be disregarded.